Hello and welcome to Questioning Behaviour, the podcast show where two PhD students talk to people both more qualified and more knowledgeable than themselves and try to make sense of the world around them.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the dummy that don't believe in science.
And those two PhD students are coming into your ears right now. My name is Sarah Bowen and I'm here with my co-host,
Merle van der Akker. And like Sarah said, we are talking to someone much more knowledgeable today. We have the great honor to talk to an absolute industry titan. We are talking to Rory Sutherland. And I doubt he needs much of an introduction, but if you've been living under a rock for a while, Rory is a vice chairman of Ogilvy, one of the biggest consultancies in the world, and he has co-founded a behavioral science practice within the agency. I feel like there's a lot of things to be gained from someone who's so entangled into both marketing and behavioral science. So without much further ado, let's just dive into it. Okay, so today we are talking to an absolute industry titan within, the behavioral science industry and even the marketing industry. So a very warm welcome to Rory Sutherland. Now, obviously, I don't think you're going to need much of an introduction, but for us, the question is always, Rory, who are you? Introduce yourself to the audience.
For about 30 years, I've worked at Ogilvy. In fact, I joined in 1988, so it's getting on for 32 years.
How did you get into behavioral science?
Yeah, it's a very long story, but essentially, because I started in direct marketing, I accidentally discovered what I didn't know was called behavioral science very early on. Because, of course, direct marketing is and was the part of marketing and advertising where you communicate directly and therefore you have measurement. Instantaneous, individualized measurement. And in fact, the industry deserves a bit of credit for this, because I think the first randomized control trial in advertising was in the late 19th century, whereas they didn't really get started in medicine until the 1950s. So
that's good.
It's an interesting case of the commercial world being ahead of the scientific world, because when there's money at stake, you learn fairly fast. And very, very quickly, if you work in direct marketing, you will notice findings that are completely in conflict with standard economic theories about how people think, decide, and act. A classic example would be if you were selling something, you would tell people to reply in 2 weeks. And the reason you do that is you always got a higher response if you said, to get this, reply within. It's scarcity bias, effectively.
Sure.
That we didn't know it was called that, but that's what it was. So you'd always say, to enjoy this offer, reply before the 27th of July or whatever, because direct marketing people had found that you got a larger response if you actually created an artificial deadline. I'm giving the game away here. Had you replied on the 7th of August, we would have sold you the product without demur. It was simply a question that if you created a sense of urgency, you got more action, essentially.
Fair enough.
And time after time, I kept getting these recurrent findings, which were completely in defiance of any really sort of overly logical assumption about what it was that motivated human behavior. And as a result, even back in the kind of 90s, I always used to refer to the science which had no name. And it was only about, I suppose it was about sort of 15 years later in the early thousands that I discovered this thing called behavioral science. I started reading economics books by then, and I'll give a shout out, actually. Well, funnily enough, the best of them, the economic naturalists, the ones that really clinched it for me, were not the books by pure economists, but they were the books by people who are sort of biologists looking at economics. And so the Economic Naturalist by Robert Frank, also the Darwin Economy, The Mating Mind and Spent by Geoffrey Miller. So at the fusion of evolutionary psychology and economics, I found something interesting going on, and then discovered that there was this book called Nudge by Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler. I think I have the second copy of Nudge in the UK after The Prime Minister. And I know this because was very friendly with Rowan Silver, who was the Prime Minister's advisor. This was when David Cameron was Prime Minister. And Rowan was a huge devotee of this area anyway. And so both Rowan and I ordered a couple of copies of Nudge by FedEx from the US, because it came out in the US quite a few months before it came out in the UK. And by glorious coincidence at the time, I was about to become president of the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising, and I needed an agenda. And I thought, well, what advertising people, and point was beautifully made by Amos Tversky, advertising people, if they're any good, are instinctive behavioral scientists, because they have an instinctive understanding of how people generally act and decide. Now, where we'd failed, in many ways, by the way, practically, we were ahead of academics in that we, inverted commas, knew or had discovered or stumbled upon things many decades before academics discovered the same biases.
Sure.
And so this, by the way, is very, very common. If you think about...
we are aware. Sarah and I are academics. We're aware. We're behind the curve.
So Darwin went around interviewing pigeon breeders and dog breeders, because if you think about it, horse breeders already understood 90% of kind of selection.
Sure.
How this works and how you select for particular characteristics, because it was, of course, of huge important pigeon breeders. I think Darwin spent a lot of time talking to them. And so the actual understanding, the knowledge is already there in business, but it's tacit and it isn't codified. And this is where I will criticize business a lot, which is generally businesses, because it's a very, very efficient mechanism for selection, in that if you stumble on something, even through stupidity, that happens to be a counterintuitive or unknown truth, the market mechanism rewards you for it. In fact, you're rewarded more the more counterintuitive your finding is, because there's less competition in that space. One of the reasons Dyson is such a successful company is that before Dyson, nobody on earth thought there was a market for a £700 vacuum cleaner. And so when you discover that there is, you occupy more or less exclusively an incredibly lucrative market space that's all on your own. And so
how wrong we were.
I don't know. I by the way, I would have said this was a pretty weird idea, I have to say. So business tends to know it. Where business is bad and academics are much better, and this is where it's valuable, is academics codify. And this is what Amos Tversky said. What Daniel and I do is we take the things that advertising executives and car salesmen already know, and we kind of codify them and classify them in a kind of recognizable academic structure. Now, I think the reason that's very useful, and I'll explain this, and it's only occurred to me more recently. We do a thing in the behavioural science practice now. Sorry, I've leapt forward 30 years.
It's okay. Go for it.
Lateral category analysis. There's a Soviet thing called TRIZ. Have you ever come across this?
I'm afraid I don't know that much about the Soviet approach to behavioral science.
No, well, it was a Soviet innovation methodology, and it was based on the assumption that most problems had already been solved, but they'd been solved in a different domain to yours.
Yes, that sounds familiar.
And so someone somewhere had solved the problem, but because your language was different and you weren't thinking you were only thinking in terms of how to run a loyalty program, not how to manage industrial pumps, you didn't notice the recurring patterns. And so why I think this is so useful, incredibly useful, the codification, is because you get the same patterns at completely different scales, recurring all over the place. And actually, complexity theory is really a game of pattern recognition. It's not a game of laws or rules. And I think by trying to make business and by trying to make behavioral science Newtonian, by trying to make it physics, we're actually missing we're losing the plot slightly. When people tell me things don't replicate, I go, I never expected them to.
Okay.
Why are you surprised? Okay. Now, replication will be a massive crisis in physics. Okay.
Slightly.
Because in the field of very, very large numbers, you do achieve something which is pretty much akin to a universal law or rule.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
In behaviour, so much of behaviour is context-driven.
Yes.
That, first of all, you'd never expect everybody to behave in the same way.
No.
Because people are different and context is different. And you never expect universal rules, because what the best you can hope for is recurring patterns.
All right. I'll stop my PhD research right now.
Because I remember reading one bit of academic research which was into behavioural science, and the experiment which involved altruism. Okay.
Yeah.
And it was an idea where you gave someone something, suggested that they might share some of their winnings with somebody else, and saw what happened. Okay. And so the experiment was, somebody went up to someone at a bus stop in Las Vegas and said, I've got all these unused chips worth $200. And I'm leaving town. So here, why don't you have these $200? And if you like, you can give some of them to that guy over there. And it was quite a clever experiment, because only in Vegas would you have a currency that was suddenly about to become worthless. You see?
Right.
Now, the interesting thing was that very few people showed any evidence of generosity. And I said, well, hold on a second. What you've got to remember before you do this is that Vegas is probably the scam capital of the world.
Oh, absolutely. Okay? Mm-hmm.
If anybody in Vegas is engaging in an act of generosity, you either just say, I just seem to have lucked out, or this is part of some elaborate hoax or con designed to make me lose money or make me look like an idiot. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I said, the idea that we wouldn't behave the same way in Vegas versus if we were in the West Country in England and someone came out and said, I've baked too many scones today, and I've got 200 scones too many. So here's 100 scones for you. And if you want, if that's too many, if you want to share them with that guy over there, that'll be fine. Right? Now,
nice accent, Rory.
Okay. In a different setting, we behave in a completely different way.
True.
Okay.
Right. But in that case, I'm quite curious. So, I mean, disregarding the context of Vegas, but looking into the context of trading or giving someone, donating someone a good versus money, isn't that a very specific context as well? Because I've always had the idea that most people are very different when it comes to sharing money compared to sharing goods, especially a good where, like, someone can always use more money. At least most of the population in the world, I'm sure, can. Whereas, there's only a finite amount of scones you can eat before they go bad.
Absolutely right. No. And so, I mean, of course, the evolutionary people would say that a lot of reciprocal altruism evolved in settings where if you killed an elephant, there was no way you could eat the damn elephant before it went off. Okay, sure. And so there was always going to be, from a hunting kill, there was going to be wasted surplus. So it paid you to swap when you had overkill, to misuse a word, when you had, in other words, more meat than you could eat. It made obvious sense to engage in reciprocal altruism, whereas in things like gathering activity, you didn't have the same behavior, because there you basically ate what you picked. And so people generally didn't share surplus fruit to the same extent to which they shared surplus meat. And you look in anthropology and find these cultures where generally the person who catches the antelope or whatever it may be generally will get the best cut of meat, if God doesn't get the even better cut, which happens in some cases. Okay.
Sure.
But generally they'll get the best cut of meat, and then they'll share out according to some rule other pieces. So you maintain incentive structures, but you have a degree of reciprocality. And so this is a perfect point, which is that looking for universal rules when humans have evolved in a very high context society, setting, where there's a huge difference between berries and meat. There isn't a universal rule about what you should do. And so my point about patterns and complexity theory is mostly about recurring patterns. The fact that there aren't rules is just a feature of the system. But where the patterns are really important, and why this is so important, is because people who are trying to make decisions based on rules rather than patterns, very interestingly, and it's worth remembering that I think both business and government are disproportionately biased towards wanting to pretend there are rules. Because when you make a decision in an institutional setting, you're drawn towards any methodology or model which gives you a single unambiguous right answer.
Right.
Because then you can't be blamed for the outcome. If you use any degree of subjectivity, or use any degree of creativity, or any degree of counterintuitive thinking, okay, the second you deviate from the single right answer high school maths model of the world, you're forced to make subjective decisions, which is frightening. And so, in a sense, the model told me to do this is the 21st century equivalent of I was only following orders.
Very nicely put. I can see where we would get to that. So in that case, is having bigger data a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a good thing if you allow people to ignore some of the data, and you allow people to interpret it with nuance. I think it's a disastrous thing if people try and essentially construct answers which use all the data, because much of it is highly distracting, and some of it is downright wrong, not least because, as I repeatedly say, all big data comes from the same place, the past. And the point is, before Dyson, there was nothing in the vacuum cleaner market data that told you there was an opportunity for a £700 vacuum cleaner. Before Nespresso came along, there was nothing in the data that suggested that people would pay 70 pence for a coffee they made themselves at home. Okay, So bearing in mind that data simply tells you what is, it doesn't tell you what could be, which is the first big caveat. And most people, as Herbert Simon says, most people aren't involved in science, which is effectively the extrapolation from existing knowledge of what you know. Most people's jobs, medicine, advertising, marketing, if you're practicing what Herbert Simon calls design, you're trying to create a new, different future. You're not trying to extrapolate rules from the past. And so those events like Nespresso, which is a kind, essentially you would have looked at the data for home consumed coffee, and you would have said, okay, the median's around, 8p a cup. Okay, the mean is here. There is a tiny group of people who kind of buy Jamaican Blue Mountain unroasted, take it out to a shed, roasted over kind of hickory wood. And those people would have spent 80 pence on a cup of coffee, but they would at the time have been a tiny fraction of the market, so small as to have seemed irrelevant. And then Nespresso comes along and puts the coffee in a pod. Starbucks, which is probably important to the genesis of Nespresso, because Starbucks has got us acclimatized to paying £3 when we're in a cafe. So paying 70 pence when we're at home didn't quite feel so egregious anymore.
Sure.
The fact that it was a pod meant that we didn't compare the price to that of instant coffee because we couldn't make the comparison. And so when you add all those things together, then three interesting events in concatenation suddenly lead to an entirely new possibility, which means that everything you thought you knew was wrong. And so, yes, I mean, it's absolutely right that you should use what you know, as long as you're allowed some subjective judgment about the use you put it to. If you try and look for and I think the danger in business and in economics, and in, by the way, in pandemic modelling, the really important thing in all this modelling of the pandemic, which strikes me as blindingly obvious, is everybody's trying to model something based on the data we have, but the data we need to know is completely different to most of the data we have. So R1 or R0, is a totally generalizable thing. Now, R0 is actually not very interesting information. It simply tells you, oh my God, this thing is spreading. We need to do something drastic. That's all you can do in response to an R0 that's above 1. What we really need to know is what's the variance in R0, which is where are the super spreading events happening, and where can people actually meet and form social contacts without much risk of spreading. We also need to know things which we still don't solidly know, like is there a correlation between the severity of the initial dose of infection and the size of the initial dose of the infection and the severity of the outcome? And no one seems to know that. Well, I mean, can't we do some experiments? I mean, on animals or something?
Isn't that happening currently?
Well, I mean, they solved it in the 18th century in Britain brilliantly. They solved the ethical problem because when they tested the effectiveness of variolation for smallpox, they used people who are sentenced to be hanged. And they simply said, if you undergo this experiment and you survive, we'll set you free.
Oh, lovely.
So there was no ethical dilemma at all, you see, because the death penalty gave you essentially a nil ethical risk group on which to work.
Well, that's good to know. That's great.
Yeah, we've lost so much from losing the death penalty.
I know.
What is the modern equivalent? Like, do you have a group of people you sort of wish to get rid of? I feel like we're getting into very dangerous territory by just asking that question.
No, I know. I mean, there is an interesting. I mean, there's a purely utilitarian argument, which I think is no doctor would perform it, but you could pay people to have very mild levels of infection who are very low risk. I don't know, but you could make an economic case for that. I don't think you could ever make an ethical case for it.
It would be difficult.
Well, I'm interested. If we're only really looking at what we know, and what we know isn't what we need to know, like how much of this is due to hindsight bias? Like what is stopping us from just getting people in a room and figuring out where are the gaps in the information which we would need to shine light on this situation? Like, why isn't this happening, do you think?
Well, there's someone at Google who's their head of something like data analytics. And I can't remember her name, but I can remember her Twitter handle, which is @Quaesita, which is Quaesita. And her distinction is data is stuff that you're given from the Latin, okay? It's literally things you are given. Quaesita are things that you seek. And one of the problems, she makes this distinction, I think it's one incredibly important distinction, which is what matters in business, what matters in real life as opposed to academia. Because there are no Nobel Prizes in business, right? If I find something out but don't make any money, no one awards me anything. Okay. Now, in science, the reward is to have proved or have shown something. In business, the only things we're really interested in is what information is necessary to achieve some material end. And generally, what you need to know to do that versus what information you have is very, very different. Now, I take a really extreme view on this big data question, which is what data do we have and what data don't we have? Mm-hmm. Well, we have data about what is, and we might have behavioural data about how people react to what is, okay? And that would seem to be great because we go, okay, under these circumstances, people do that. Now, there's a problem here because you're assuming very, very simplistic model of human epistemology and perception. Because you're assuming people's willingness to pay 70p for a coffee is independent of the existence or non-existence of Starbucks and independent of whether it's in a pod or a jar. Now, the way humans perceive things is comparative for a start. And so something can be cheap or expensive depending on what you compare it to. I persuaded my dad to get satellite TV. I offered to pay for him to have it. I argued because he only had 3 channels. He loves factual television, doesn't like sport or movies. But I said, look, the Sky Factual, the news package, is actually pretty cheap. Mm-hmm. And it was only when I said, well, it's not £17 a month, it's 60p a day. And he said, well, what difference does that make? He's a good enough mathematician. Okay, to say, well, that doesn't make any difference. I said, yes, it does, because you spent £2 a day on newspapers. So if you spend £2 a day on newspapers, it's not that crazy spending another 60p to have a huge, gamut of factual television. And so once you realize that we actually decide things relatively, mm-hmm. and our epistemology hasn't evolved for a world of objective information, of perfect trust and perfect information. And we don't have great predictive value of utility. We can't say, we can't tell how much utility we derive from something will depend as much on how you market it. In other words, our desire to buy something is as much dependent on how you market it as what it is.
So then my question becomes, is this marketing or is this behavioral science? Because I struggle to find out what the exact difference is.
I think behavioral science has a huge amount to teach marketing, business, and public policy. Mm-hmm. because by reliably showing that human behavior does not conform to these narrow, reductionist, deterministic sort of models, what you do, much to their discomfort, I might add, okay, because in many ways what businesses want, what business people want, not business overall, but what an individual person working for a large organization wants, is they want a very narrow solution set, so that they can say, well, it's a choice between A and B, and on balance, the model tells us to choose A. Now, I would argue as a creative person, I want the opposite. I want the solution set to be as wide as possible. And my view of behavioral science is it's not a very good science, okay? If you're looking for aeronautics or engineering or physics, it's a bit crap. Things don't replicate. It's messy. You always need to test in the specific situation. But the huge value of behavioral science is it massively expands the possible solution set and the possible non-fuck-up set, which is the opposite of a solution set. So
it's important, that one.
Yeah, the non-fuck-up set, expanding the solution set means that you can look at a problem and say, you're assuming this is economic, it might be psychological. You don't have to drop the price or develop an incentive. What you do need to do is develop a message that explains this to people. And you will achieve the same behavioral change without reducing the price or without an economic incentive or without legislation, simply by redesigning the choice architecture in which people act, okay? Now, that's hugely valuable because in many cases, people who assume economics are true are walking around with a toolkit which consists of basically change the product, cut the price, okay? And so expanding that solution set, even though to some extent it's unpopular because people love their tube map. You know, they use the tube map even when it's misleading because they love the sense of certainty it provides. Okay, and the other thing it does is it actually it also reduces the potential fuck up map because you can say what you are doing here is completely economically logical, but we have psychological reasons to believe that it may fail. And the third thing it does is it changes the nature of an explanation. In many cases, economics claims the credit for things which are actually psychological.
Yes, but it has done that, I think, since the 1920s.
Yeah, a bit of self-aggrandizing, I think, economists are.
Well, no, but I mean, if you think about it, people will always favour an economic explanation. If you have to, the example I always give is, okay, why are there more fish restaurants by the sea? This was in my Nudgestock talk. And everybody will go supply, logistics, ready access to fresh food. That's the Harvard Business School answer, isn't it? But if that were true, you'd find loads of fish restaurants 5 miles inland, and you don't. And my theory is it's simply that when you're by the sea, fish tastes better.
I'm sure it does.
And rosé wine tastes better by the sea, apparently. You know, when you're in France.
Yeah. I wouldn't know. I don't drink the stuff.
No, I don't either. I think it's absolute piss. I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad we're the last two holdouts against the rosé.
I can't drink it. I think it tastes awful. It smells awful, and it gives me a nasty headache.
It's okay. I'll have your glasses. That's fine. I'll take one for the team.
I see.
But the interesting thing is, if you take something like the 5p tax on polythene bags, okay, the standard explanation is people didn't take a polythene bag because they had to pay 5p. Now, I can absolutely assure you that in my case, that was not the reason I did not take a polythene bag. But I can also argue that the assumption there is if you make it 10p, if you make it 15p, if you make it 20p, then you're making it correspondingly more effective. You will make it a bit more effective. I'm not denying that economics has some effect. Certainly if you made a polythene bag £2,000, I think it's fair to say that use of polythene bags would fall quite dramatically. I'm not denying that.
But they might become luxury items. They might signal some type of value.
Yeah, look at me. Look at your crappy mulberry. Look, I've got a Sainsbury's. Yeah, absolutely right. The interesting thing there, though, the main thing it did is it changed the nature of the default. Because before, the default was that the shopkeeper gave you your aspirin and razors in a bag. And if they didn't provide a bag and hand you the goods in a bag, it was rude. Okay. Similarly, even if you were already carrying a capacious bag, having been handed the goods in a bag, you'd have to be a pretty committed environmentalist to go through the social embarrassment.
Yes.
No, I don't want a bag. Okay, take that bag now. Right? You look like a flaming nut job, right? So basically what it did is by forcing and making it socially normal for the shopkeeper to go, do you want a bag? They're 5p. And me to look down and go, I've got an already adequate bag. I won't bother. By changing the defaults within the conversation. You can do the same, by the way, if you're a pizza delivery firm, okay? Everybody rings up. The default is as soon as possible delivery. And if you're a bit run off your feet, if you're a pizza delivery person, you can just change the default by going, it's 8:30, okay, or do you want it any earlier? Okay? And 70% of people will go along with the new proposed time. So the point is that by changing the assumed social norm around bag provision, more of the effect, I think, arose through that than arose through the 5p charge. But it gave shops a license to ask a question which previously they couldn't ask.
Fair enough.
I was going to say, I'm interested because one of the things that has been brought to my attention about the difference between marketing and
behavioural science,
whether it's arbitrary or not to even be talking about it, is the focus on mechanisms and sort of the value of focusing on trying to derive what the mechanisms are as to why a certain intervention worked in this context and why it didn't work in another context. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Let's go wide. Let's go wide. Okay, what's the difference between business and academia? Okay.
I don't want to upset our audience.
No, I'm going to upset the audience. What I think is often overlooked by academics is that mostly business is presented, and I blame the financial pages for this, as a kind of great big greed machine. Okay, I'm principally in business because it's a way in which I can be curious while being fairly well remunerated. Okay,
that is very fair.
So honest.
I'm just a greedy anthropologist. My great aunt was an anthropologist. She was Beatrice Blackwood, and you can go to the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford and see all her footage of, I think it was the people of the Upper Wutut, somewhere in Borneo or whatever, and. But I'm a greedy anthropologist, basically. I'm an anthropologist with a jag. Now, let me explain.
Oh, you can put that in your Twitter bio.
Let me explain. Business is, in fact, not through any intent it's emerged. It's an extraordinarily good problem-solving mechanism. Mm-hmm. Secondly, remember that the bigger problem in real life isn't the invention, it's the rollout. So I don't dispute for a second that the Australians who came up using Fourier transforms, who came up with Wi-Fi, were spectacular geniuses. But their problem, compared to the problem of getting Wi-Fi in every cafe, home, business in the developed world within the space of 7 years, trust me, the second problem is a bigger problem than the first, okay? And capitalism solved that problem. Right? With lots and lots of people, some of them very stupid, some of them very lucky, some of them certifiable idiots, okay? But nonetheless, bumbling in and finding out what pays and what doesn't. And so capitalism is basically stupid people within an intelligent system, and academia is basically intelligent people within a stupid system. Now, let me explain my academia.
I like that.
Okay? Because a lot of business people are stupid. I mean, there are people who basically stumble onto something. Okay. In fact, stupidity in business can be an advantage because you don't suffer. Now, you're more likely to fail, but when you succeed, if you're stupid, you'll be disproportionately successful because your ignorance has taken you into a space where no logical or intelligent person would have gone, and by chance you found that it happens to be a lucrative space. Now, business basically rewards anything that does the job, regardless of the means obtained to get there. Okay, so it can be luck, it can be stupidity. You don't need reasons. Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Anything that happens to prove successful enough to be self-sustaining becomes a business and then rewards more and more people for investing more time and effort in that particular area. Mm-hmm. So it's an extraordinarily kind of evolutionary mechanism for problem solving, which is, however, like evolution, completely sort of value neutral in that the quality of your reason, the reasoning that got you there, doesn't have any bearing on how much reward you get for getting there. Now, that isn't true of a Nobel Prize.
I don't think you can stumble on a Nobel Prize. I'm afraid not.
So, all that kind of, it doesn't care about your workings out. It just cares about the answer. That, in a sense, is brilliant, isn't it? It's not like that shit maths thing where you've got enough to get the right answer. No. Right. Now, there's a downside. Now, if you read, for example, the latest book by Matt Ridley, which is called How Innovation Works, or you read a book by Terence Keeley, who is, he also claims that most advances are actually pioneered, in a sense, commercially, and then are post-rationalized academically. Okay. Certainly true of aeronautics, by the way, it was experimentation, which was then codified. And I would argue that actually behavioral science is largely codifying the kind of things. This is why I think it's great to be in business, because business to me is the Galapagos Islands of social science. Okay. I can wander around, obviously without a beard. Do you have a little claim to fame here? I was born in Llanbaddock, so I've got exactly the same birthplace as Alfred Russel Wallace. So there you go, tiny Welsh village. But anyway, I consider myself basically a naturalist. I wander around capitalism, go, why don't people use moist toilet paper? Why was nobody using video conferencing before the pandemic when it was fucking obvious that this was important technology? Why don't people have Japanese toilets? That's one of my obsessions. Okay.
Yeah, that's a very good question. What's the answer?
And I can look at consumer, but there are quite a few. It's a very interesting one, actually. There are quite a few. That may be an intermediary thing, that plumbers don't like installing them. It's also a problem in the UK because we have a thing called the ballcock and cistern mechanism, which most countries don't have. So it's harder to retrofit them. You tend to need sort of a main supply. So anyway, but nonetheless, still worth it, trust me. But there is, what I wouldn't say, some of those books almost take an anti-academic line. Taleb argues about teaching birds to fly, that actually practical people using the evolutionary mechanism, which is roughly speaking, this is why a Soviet control economy was never any good, because you needed to have a reason before you could have an idea, right? Sure. You could never get Red Bull or Nespresso in a Soviet economy.
Shame.
Because you have people going, okay, we've had a meeting of the Politburo, and for our next 7-year plan, we've decided that what the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics really needs is an overpriced, disgusting, tasty drink in a tiny can, right? You're never going to come up with that. Just as design is never going to come up with the kangaroo, is it? Right? Okay.
I guess not.
Oh, no, fuck this walking thing. Come on. We're tired of the walking thing. We've proven in 99% of animals that walking is a great means of locomotion. Let's go for the fucking bounce, man. Right? Okay. Not gonna happen. Okay. By the way, why that is, I'd love to know. Does anyone, why is it advantageous for the kangaroo to jump, whereas everything else on the planet walks? I don't know.
Not a clue. We will make sure in the description of this episode to do some research into the mobility of the kangaroo and its development.
And so the other thing is, the other really important thing about business is academia cherishes the single right answer. Business operates in a field where there's more than one right answer, and where the opposite of a good idea can be another good idea, and where to solve a problem, you often need to do 7 things, not 1. So I think business is basic. The reason business is bigger than academia is simple. It's because it's better.
I'm
winding up your. No, but all I'm saying is, until you understand the evolutionary genius, not designed by anybody, I hasten to add, I don't think it was planned by anybody, until you understand the genius within the system, which is its variation and selection. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second, I think that by codifying patterns, you can accelerate the efficacy of how business works, by giving names to these things, and also by giving them scientific credibility, by going, this guy may not be a charlatan, he may be onto something, because idiosyncratic fit heuristic may be a thing. That's hugely valuable. Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Let's not burn the academics just yet. It's not witchcraft.
My brother's an astrophysicist. My brother's an academic. Loads of my family have been academics. All I'm asking them to appreciate is that there is inherent within free market capitalism. It's something which doesn't always work, by the way, but it is genius resident in the network, not in the people. And as a result, I think it's much more. I always think that evolutionary science should be taught at schools, right? Absolutely massive. I would have a term dedicated 50% to basically, Darwin, Russell Wallace, the whole non-teleological model of understanding. Why? Doesn't matter. My wife's a vicar, right? It doesn't bother me whether evolution is true or not. Anyway, it doesn't tell you anything about the existence of God, regardless of what Dawkins thinks. It just says that God doesn't believe in control economies, right?
Sure.
God's not a micromanager. Now, what is important is that evolution, if you understand evolution, it gifts you a completely new way to think. Mm-hmm. Okay. And there are a couple of things I really encourage. So the things I'd encourage to anybody who wants to be a creative person in general, cryptic crosswords, if you have them. Now, some countries have them, some countries don't. America doesn't have them, for example. Britain, Australia, India, the rest of the English-speaking world does.
Okay.
That's colonialism.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
It's a rather lovely thing. The Times of India, the crossword setter, was also, I think, the head of the Indian Navy. There was some fantastic thing that for some time after independence, that there was an admiral who also set the cryptic crosswords.
We need a hobby.
The cryptic crossword, by the way, if you think about it, along with cricket, and then we get curry. Not bad value exchange, I've got to say. Now, anyway,
I love curry. I don't give a damn about cricket, so I think you did pretty good out of that one.
But the interesting thing there is that detective fiction is the other one. Crime fiction.
Yes.
We love crime. I mean, we don't love crime, but we do love crime.
One of the strangest things, by the way, are you watching that Golden State Killer thing in the States with Joseph James D'Angelo?
No.
Eron
or
the GSK. So he's just pleaded guilty to this extraordinary series of crimes. I only discovered it about 2 years ago. These crimes were mostly in the 70s and 80s, 60s, 70s and 80s, I think. Absolutely extraordinary crime spree that they caught him through DNA.
Yes, I remember this.
Ancestral tracing of DNA. So they went right back they found some sort of common ancestor by going to open source DNA databases.
Wild.
Then effectively detection became genealogy. So they basically had to go down and go, well, who meets the kind of geographical profile for someone who is in Northern California at this time, frequently in Southern California. And so this guy had been the subject of this I'll Be Gone in the Dark was the sort of best-selling book around this search for him. Do you know the weirdest thing about this? I'm actually a slight outlier because an obsession with true life crime, particularly serial killers, leans heavily female. Do you know that?
Yes, my mom is completely and utterly obsessed with true crime.
I have a hypothesis.
Please, I've always wondered why it is. Yeah, go on.
I think because the victims of these violent crimes are predominantly women, there's this sort of weird fascination of like, if I can understand someone who would brutalize women, I could maybe understand how would I protect myself. Because I've had this like weird fascination since I was young.
You're honing your psychopath early warning radar.
But this is the thing. If anyone tries to kill me, I'm scratching your face. Your DNA is going to be under my fingernails. I'm tracking my location. I've sent all your details to my friends. They know that my iPhone is tracking me. So you're not going to get away with it. That's what I'm going to say.
But you're still dead. It's a bit unfortunate.
I'm still dead, but you know.
But he's not going to do it to anybody else.
Hopefully.
Because this is really interesting because Geoffrey Miller has a theory that certain behaviours, I was going to be very mischievous here and say that certain behaviours that men find slightly baffling, or normal men find baffling, are in fact advanced psychopath detection. So, for example, turning up late to a date, right? Mm-hmm. The interesting thing is that most normal non-psychopathic blokes will go, oh, no, I've only just got here myself. You know, traffic's terrible, isn't it? Okay. But if the guy you turn up late to the date to is really angry, I've been sitting here on my own looking like a complete idiot, and has a hissy fit. So this is a terrible thing, I shouldn't admit this, but I experiment with my wife in behaviour. No, that's a real turn off. And it's a terrible thing to do, and you shouldn't do it. But it fascinates me, which is what are male behaviours that are massive alarm bells for women? And so
there are whole Reddit threads about this, Rory. There are whole Reddit threads dedicated to this, if you're interested.
I've got some life experience if you also just want to talk about that. I've got a long list of red flags.
The interesting thing is the genders in dating world really don't understand the context for the other person, because most blokes going on a date with a woman are basically shitting themselves because they're terrified she won't like them, and they're terrified of rejection. And the idea that they're a physical threat to her, in other words, that she's worried because you could be physically dangerous, I would honestly say it never occurred to me until about 10 years ago. It just didn't occur to me that there was this fear of, what if this guy's a nutter? Okay. Now, it's one of those strange things that herd immunity, because I was familiar with the phrase, it never occurred to me that it would cause a massive kind of press and public outcry. Because to me, that was just the word you used, herd immunity. So the use of the word herd didn't really mean cow or cattle anymore to me. So how the same word in a completely, depending on whether you're familiar or unfamiliar with it, can be, and that's something in advertising which is really, really important, because, we might be assuming things about a target audience that are completely wrong assumptions, for example.
Yeah, right.
And so no. I mean, the behavioural science thing, my argument is very simple, is that I see Nudgestock as a festival of behavioural science in academia and in practice. And my view is that, look, given that, we can all have, I'm only taking the piss, I'm yanking your chain with that point that business has a better methodology than academia does. But actually, the reward system supports far more people in many ways.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's a very well-funded social science experiment. So my argument is academics should look at consumer capitalism because it's the best-funded social science experiment on the planet. But at the same time, as business people, we have a huge amount to learn from academics who have codified and named and also verified through experiment, something which we often don't have the money or the inclination to do. Now, I'm going to give a really big slam attack on business now, which I think is interesting, which is the fact that 2 years ago, I, as someone with my own particular mentality, started experimenting with my own team and remote working. And I wanted to see what would get people to work remotely or work from home, or at the stage before coronavirus, it could equally be in a cafe or at your parents' house at the weekend, whatever. Okay. So what would get people to do it, and whether there were productivity gains and unexpected benefits to arise from the practice. And we discovered, actually, one thing I discovered is if you said to people, you're free to work from home, by the way, I don't mind if you work from home one day a week. Nobody did. Yeah, no. Now, the interesting thing was people viewed it then, they framed it as a concession, and they felt they were burning reputational currency every time they took advantage of it. The only way I got my staff to work from home is when I said, no, you're not understanding me here. I want you to work from home for one day a week, because my contention is that your work will be better if it's produced in variegated settings. So being in the same open plan office for 5 days is less likely to produce breakthrough work than being in an open plan office for 3 days, on a train for the 4th day and at home for the 5th.
Sure. And did you lead by example?
So I did, yeah. We created Zoom Fridays, and we all used to get together for a chat Friday morning, which often didn't happen in the office because someone was having breakfast and someone was somewhere else. And we discovered significant upside benefits to video conferencing, which we never even envisaged, never mind the saving in time and transport and commuting. And it suddenly occurred to me, this happened then because the coronavirus came in and millions of people said, actually, I prefer this to normal work. I get more done. I'm more productive. In some cases, depending on your attitude to video conversation, it's more sociable. The meetings have a different nature to them. They may be less hierarchical. There may be a more diverse mix of attendees. Introverts, by the way, I think are bullied in, not so much in academia, I suspect, but I suspect introverts are bullied in the business world because it's much easier for extroverts to bully introverts than the other way around. Okay, hey, let's go to a party is something extroverts require other people to go along with them in order to be happy. Whereas introverts don't go, if you don't sit silently and read Proust with me, I'm going to sulk. Okay, you don't get introverts doing that. They just go off and read Proust. Okay.
I love your idea of extroverts and introverts. I don't think Sarah is reading Proust by any means, and nor am I sitting in the corner because no one wanted to go to a party.
Maybe I should. Maybe I should. That's where I'd be most happy.
Maybe it is time to go into Proust. Who knows?
But my conclusion about all this is that life is surprisingly cruel to people who, to some degree, are content with their own company. In a funny kind of way, you might argue that retirement is too much that way, but that work is too much the other way.
Sure.
But anyway, with this experiment, with this experiment, what's so interesting about it is that my criticism of business is it is obvious that within Zoom and Blue Jeans and the other video calling technologies, never mind the money saving. That wasn't what really interested me. The money saving was significant. The time saving was more significant. Environmental benefit was even more significant. And then on top of that, you had the thing that, look, nearly always when you discover a new technology, there are things about it which are bad, and there are things about it which are good and amazingly good. But quite often those things aren't what you'd predict before you start using them.
That's right.
People thought the telephone was going to be a way of broadcasting concerts to the home. Okay, if you look at the early history of most inventions, Merle, are you from a country where they answer the phone ahoy, or am I wrong?
Not really. They just say hoy, or
Hoi hoi.
Hoy hoy.
Graham Bell, because they had to invent a whole new etiquette around answering the phone, which is what do you say? You see, and so they took ahoy from nautical language. And Alexander Graham Bell actually proposed that when you answer the phone, you said ahoy. From Alan Potts.
Oh my gosh, I'm going to start doing that.
But the interesting thing is, if you look at most of these inventions, quite often the radio they thought of exclusively as a person-to-person medium, and broadcast didn't really occur to them. Okay, and weirdly, the telephone they thought of as a broadcast medium, and until I think, let me get this right, I've got a vague memory that something like Budapest used to have a kind of telephone news service until the 1970s or something, based on this assumption of Graham Bell. And quite often the street finds its own uses for things. You have an invention. So one of the reasons I spend a fortune on consumer electronics is because quite often there are things like yogurt makers which you should never buy, or bread slicers. Never buy those. Trust me, okay? Then there are things like bread makers which I don't get, because it's not like bread is widely available and cheap, but my dad absolutely loves making his own bread. And then you have things like the Philips air fryer, for example, or the Japanese toilet, which are complete game changers when you buy them. But you can't tell in advance. And so experimentation I find really, really interesting, because so often, if you read the history of invention and discovery, I'll give you a lovely example of this. When Jeffreys at the University of Leicester was doing his research on what became DNA fingerprinting, okay, he said to an audience, he said, this may actually become important in crime detection because you'll be able to find someone's DNA and you'll be able to link it back to the original perpetrator. The reaction to that was people burst out laughing.
Oh, well, I'm glad I didn't discourage him.
Yeah, we're all glad. As true life crime fans, actually, we should have crowdfunded Alec Jeffreys.
Yeah, but I wasn't around. Okay.
There's nothing I enjoy more than reading a really good cold case that gets solved. 30 years later, there's this 70-year-old bloke who's being handcuffed and hauled away for some perversion he did in the 1960s. Yeah. We love those better than anything else, don't we?
Yeah.
The idea of this guy with 25 years going, and also if you think about Joseph James D'Angelo, he must have been reading every single fucking news article on DNA and progress and going, did they keep the kits from the crimes? In other words, did they throw away the evidence? What's the likelihood? And ancestral DNA, what it did for him was that some third cousin of his uploaded his DNA not to the kind of 32andMe things, but to an open source database. A relative of mine did that and discovered they had a half sister they never knew about. I won't go.
I thought you were going to go very differently, and they discovered they had been a perpetrator of a serial murder.
When you think about it, there's a really good detective story here about a guy, right, who committed a hideous crime in his 20s and has got away with it. Meanwhile, his brother is kind of starting to get into something like drink driving or something a bit minor. And the guy realizes that if my brother gets arrested for drink driving, basically I'm doing a lifer stretch in the nonces wing at Wakefield Prison, right? I'm in for a 30 stretch. What family dynamics would be created in the sense that you were a past, major offender who'd gone honest? And then meanwhile out there, you've got this close relative who's kind of involved in minor pilfering. What a weird thing that's going to be.
That's just another murder in the making. That a brother with the drunk driving is gonna disappear or have an accident.
The guy in the Croydon killing, and I can't remember his name, but he murdered someone in Croydon, a sort of model in Croydon sometime. The extraordinary thing is, having done this, okay, and he's got away with it because his DNA isn't on the database. And then he goes to Australia, where I think we suspect he's committed some further crimes, quite likely in Australia. He was a chef when he was arrested at a pub in Surrey or Sussex, I think. And you can add on a caption. You can add the Wikipedia link when I remember what the name is. And the extraordinary thing is, he got into a pub fight because someone spilt his beer. And you think, if you got your DNA on record for a murder, okay, and you go down the pub, you'd think you'd have the self-control, wouldn't you, to go,
No.
Don't you worry, I'll buy you another pint. It was my fault. No. He gets into some weird scrap.
Maybe he was under immense pressure. I have a feeling like the idea that you can casually, commit crimes and not experience any type of psychological residue as a result. I mean, you're a true psycho or sociopath if you're completely fine with that.
Yeah, it's probably something to do with the extreme narcissism and hubris that these people feel untouchable.
If you don't mind, Rory, I'm gonna ask you the start of the last questions because I can imagine, because I think initially we were scheduled only for 1 hour, so I can imagine you might have other things to do. It's been a great episode. We've talked about many things.
We should do a separate true life crime episode.
We will record a true life crime episode. We'll just invite you again, and we'll just continue talking about that.
If the listener could take away 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 things, what would you like them to take with them away from this episode?
I want to tie that together, by the way. True life crime, cryptic crosswords, and behavioural science, and evolutionary biology and behavioural science, okay, are all, first and foremost, really, really valuable because they provide you with a different model of thinking. In cryptic crosswords, it's ignore the surface, find out decode what's going on beneath. In behavioural science, if you assume that the real why of human behaviour isn't the same as the official why, it's an immense act of creative liberation. Detective fiction is to some extent teaching you to think backwards. There's a wonderful passage in Sherlock Holmes about the skill of thinking backwards. Not, we've evolved to think this happened, so what's going to happen next? It's a different mode of thinking to go, this is now the present state of affairs. What are the prior states of affairs that could have led to this consequence? That's a different mode of thinking. And I think crime helps you do that. And so those are 4 hobbies, cryptic crosswords, crime, Darwinian and evolutionary psychology, and just evolutionary thinking, and behavioural science, are all rewarding, I think, because they're... the great phrase of Alan Kay is that a change in perspective is worth 80 IQ points. And they allow you to come along. It's like knowing London when you don't just have the tube map, you also have a rail map and a bus map, and you're aware of the existence of taxis, okay? And that's what I'm saying, is that most people want a tube map. They just want to go through life using the same model and the same metrics for every decision they make. And when you go to them with a different map, their first reaction is disbelief and annoyance. And yet, my argument is that most persistent problems require non-conventionally rational solutions on the grounds that if there were a logical solution, we already would have found it. Okay, the fact that the problem is persistent may mean it's solvable. It may mean that it's logic proof. In other words, the real way to solve this is to do something fundamentally different.
All right. Good takeaway message. I'm sure the audience can do quite a lot with that. Very last question, Rory. If people want to keep up with you and your work, where can they find you online? Where would you like to be stalked?
By default, Twitter, at Rory Sutherland. It's all one word, Rory, Sutherland as in Kiefer. That's kind of where the resemblance ends, to be honest. The interesting thing, that's simply because it's the largest network, and I tend to post there first. And also Nudgestock. If you follow Nudgestock as well on Twitter, and also go to nudgestock.co.uk and register for the database. Even though the event's already happened, there's nothing to stop you watching it on YouTube. And so that's what you might call very interesting thing, by the way, because businesses are going to have to invent completely new ways of talking to each other, because the conference and the large-scale meeting and the trade fair aren't going to be happening for another 8 months, because they're potential super spreader events and they tend to be very global.
Right.
So, how do you a very big, very interesting issue in things like, particularly in German business, where they've been very, very heavily reliant on those kind of trade fairs. B2B marketing has got to completely reinvent itself pretty rapidly.
Rory, thanks so much for coming on. So that was us talking to the absolutely amazing Rory Sutherland. I feel like there was a lot of information in this episode. Sarah, please do disseminate.
Well, honestly, Rory, I think, just accidentally gave 5 separate TED Talks there, just one after another. Quite a talent, I have to admit. And after 32 years at Ogilvy, this is exactly the person we need to be talking to if we're interested in trying to understand the difference between marketing and behavioral science. Loads more questions have been posed in my mind rather than answered, which I know it's probably a sign of a good discussion and a fruitful discussion. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the questions that we had initially, I guess both of us, when we started this podcast series, was to try and ask people and figure out what the difference between disciplines actually are. In some cases we use terms interchangeably, and I know if you've been listening to a couple of episodes, you'll know that Merle is an absolute stickler for a definition.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, get those constraints in. So, Merle, what do you reckon? Based on what Rory's been saying, with all of his experience and hearing about how he discovered behavioural science, or what he was doing before he even knew behavioural science was a thing that went by that name, what was your take on the difference between marketing and behavioral science?
I feel like whilst identifying the difference between marketing and behavioral science, he also tore academia a nice new one as comparative to business. So for me, the difference between behavioral science and marketing is just that one feeds into the other quite a lot, and within one we care more about the underlying mechanisms. But then again, do we care enough? I think maybe the differences between marketing and behavioral science become much more apparent if we look at the differences between academia and industry, where we just see that the structure for publishing and getting new results out and getting rewarded for counterintuitive results is just very, very different within both these sectors. So it's interesting to see. It is very true. Us two still being academics, there is if you publish something or bring forth something that is so counterintuitive, you're gonna have to defend it probably till your deathbed, and then hopefully maybe it gets a place in the Hall of Fame or in every day-to-day science. Yeah. But it's interesting. I feel like I'm ironically still not too sure about the differentiation between marketing and behavioral science, and maybe that is because it isn't that easy to distinguish, and maybe it isn't that different. Maybe that's the issue.
Yeah, I mean, from Rory's experience, marketing and people within marketing have been doing behavioral science, or what we might now consider and understand to be behavioral science, way before behavioral science was even named, like given that form, that name, and grouped these sort of schools of thought together. And it was interesting actually to hear, because I think often we hear the narrative from the perspective that academia is the center, right? So and the business world revolves around academia. There's sort of a sense that academia is the ideal, and business, they're just doing something aimless over there. They don't even know what they're doing.
Yeah, well, not according to Rory Sutherland.
But I liked that. I liked that because actually, I think what Rory said was very interesting, that, in the world of business, you're rewarded not for being clever and having all the working done right in the maths problem, but for actually coming up with, the most unexpected solutions and insights, which, makes me wonder how much, have we missed as academics by not going and talking to people who run businesses or who have, developed, careers as salespeople and salesmen, because they have these little nuggets of heuristics or information or insights that it's been passed down to them, or that they've experimented themselves and come up with, these cool strategies that are probably more grounded in behavioral science and sort of evolutionary biology and psychology than they even are aware of. And that's the interesting thing, the people who are doing behavioral science but don't recognize it as behavioral science. I think that's why it's really interesting.
That, I think, is a great point to end on. To me, this episode has raised many a question. It's raised, I think, about 15 different PhD topics for someone who's interested in them. And I think, if nothing else, I'm quite happy with that result. It was an absolutely great discussion. Against Rory, thanks so much for coming on. Guys, I hope it was an enjoyable episode, an educational episode, or at least a thought-provoking episode. If so, please do let us know on the socials. You know where to find us. All of it is Questioning Behaviour or QB_podcast. And we look forward to hearing from you. And if we don't hear from you on the socials, at least we hope to see you again next week. Have a good one.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the one I love, you're the one I wanna give to. Things that made in half the time. You're the one I wanna give.
So what are those curtains doing to the left of you? Have you gone native? You've gone, yeah.
That's not a curtain.
Oh, it's not a curtain. What is it?
I think my mom got creative with some canvas and some wrapping paper. I don't even know.
Okay. I didn't want to think you were just committing some huge Dutch faux pas. And
No, I'm sitting in front of a window. See, we can still. There you go.
Oh, phew, that's right.
Yes, there it is.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah.
See, I'm still Dutch. This.
Yeah. I didn't want to think, that people caught sight of the curtain and then you went back to, every time you're in Amsterdam, people basically cross the street when you walk towards them. There's that deviant with the downstairs curtains.